Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. And thank you all for joining our press conference on the launch of the Plant-Based Treaty's Safe and Just report. Now, our report leans on the latest climate science and tells a story of interconnectedness of the food system in resolving the planetary crisis. We move beyond the carbon tunnel vision and look at the problem holistically. The Plant-Based Treaty presents a pathway to realign with both planetary and social boundaries, steering us towards an ecologically safe and socially just global food system. We have formulated a unique framework, a vegan donor economics model of the Plant-Based Treaty, which widens the lens to incorporate interspecies, intergenerational, and intragenerational justice. Here today with me to break down the 3 chapters of the report are Joy Dorrant, Plant-Based Treaty Netherlands, Janine Calvillo, a youth indigenous activist, Hoshimi Saki, Plant-Based Treaty Georgia, Enrique Nogueira, Plant-Based Treaty Netherlands, and myself, Stephen George, Plant-Based Treaty Netherlands. Now, scientists have warned us that even if we phase out fossil fuels today, food emissions alone are enough to put the 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees targets out of reach. And this concern is heightened by the fact that the current IPCC climate models optimistically assume that the current Earth systems will continue to function the way that they are doing now, even though the first cracks of Earth system destabilization are visible. Now, these models also optimistically assume that the global food system will shift from a carbon source to a carbon sink within the next 2.5 decades, despite very little progress observed in this area. So transforming our global food system, particularly addressing the impacts of animal agriculture on environmental degradation, is as important as ending fossil fuel use. Now, we know time is running short, but there is some hope that still remains. The high global warming potential of methane, which is approximately 82 times more potent than CO2 over a 20-year time frame, coupled with its atmospheric lifespan of 12.5 years, means that reducing methane emissions can quickly slow down global warming. This provides us crucial time for rapid decarbonization of our societies. And notably, in 2021, animals raised for food were the largest contributors to anthropogenic methane emissions, accounting for 36% of the total. Now, shifting away from animal agriculture not only mitigates these emissions, but also affords us the opportunity to decarbonize our global economy, transform our global food systems into a carbon sink, and restore degraded land to regenerate and strengthen the biosphere's resilience. There is a noticeable inaction in transforming our global food system. This was evident in the past 2 weeks, where governments, institutions, and scientists showed reluctance to address this issue directly. However, there is still an urgent need for policymakers to take decisive and courageous steps towards a safe and just transition of our global food system. We must begin to address the cow in the room. This involves creating a system that operates within ecological boundaries of our planet, whilst ensuring social justice and inclusivity, leaving no one behind. A holistic approach involving systems thinking, proactive stewardship, and the integration of environmental priorities into economic strategies are essential for combating the multifaceted challenges of climate change, with the global food system at its heart. So as we stand at the intersection of urgency and hope, we acknowledge our global food system's pivotal role, both as a future carbon sink and as a fundamental agent in regenerating and strengthening the biosphere's innate resilience. The approach of the Plant-Based Treaty goes beyond a critique of the status quo. It is a testament to the effectiveness of collective action and systems thinking in driving regeneration and resilience. It also serves as a powerful reminder that together, we hold the power to redefine our relationship with the planet.
Sorry. So, most of you are familiar with at least one of the planetary boundaries. Climate change. That is the one we're discussing here today, or at least in the past 2 weeks. Is this better? All right. Most of you are familiar with at least one of the planetary boundaries. Climate change is the one that we are discussing in the past 2 weeks here. It is Earth systems like climate change, biosphere functions, nutrient flows, the hydrological cycle that have kept the planet in a state with permanent ice caps, flowing rivers, a cloak of forest, reliable weather, and an abundance of life with our heavy dependence on fossil fuels. Industrial agriculture and our careless disregard, dependence on fossil fuels, industrial agriculture and our careless disregard for the environment, we have pushed some of these systems beyond their safe thresholds. In fact, out of the 9 planetary boundaries which Rockstrom and his colleagues introduced, 6 are far beyond their safe boundaries. 2 are close to being crossed in the upcoming years, and only 1, the ozone layer, is going into the right direction. Everything, including the global food system, should operate within these boundaries. The global food system, which greatly influences every aspect of the biosphere, is a primary driver of environmental degradation. Central to this system is animal agriculture, which has a considerable ecological footprint. The clearing of forest for pastures destroys habitats, releases carbon, removes crucial carbon sinks. Monocultures for animal feed to create biodiversity deserts. Over-reliance on fertilizers result in nitrogen and phosphorus buildup in our soils, with runoff damaging nearby ecosystems. Therefore, it significantly influences Earth's stability and the future for all living beings on it. Paradoxically, although the food system is presently the primary source of environmental degradation and biodiversity loss, it is also among the most fiercely affected by these deteriorations. The conversion of natural ecosystems into farmlands and pastures, alongside with the repercussions of agricultural pollution, severely threatens vital ecosystem functions that underpin agriculture itself. A complete transformation is necessary, involving changes in production, landscape management, and the entire food system. This is because all food system activities, from agriculture through processing, logistics to retail to consumption, affect planetary boundaries, and thereby they offer multiple opportunities to mitigate as well. In fact, for climate change specifically, the science is clear. Even if we phase out fossil fuel emissions today, the emissions from the food industry are enough to put the 1.5 and even 2 degrees Celsius targets out of reach, which is why we must put the food system central to combating climate change. According to several food assessments, food systems are responsible for 1/3 of all emissions, with animal foods being responsible for at least twice as much emissions as plant-based foods. The food system consumes about 55% of all ice-free land. Animal agriculture takes up 83% of it, while only providing 18% of calories and 37% of protein. We currently use land very efficiently to produce food, and the transition to plant-based diets has the potential to reduce the amount of land used by 75%, reduce water consumption by 20%. It will also reduce eutrophication and terrestrial acidification by about 50%. And this is only a reduction of resource use. Restoring 15% of agricultural land has the potential to sequester 30% of all emissions since the Industrial Revolution, and to conserve 80% of plant and animal species, and can avoid 60% of their extinction. The additional land that is freed up we can either use for ecosystem restoration or to expand low-impact farming. And this is the thing, we should not only talk about diet change, but also about how we farm, how to reduce food waste across the production and supply chain, our view and our relationship with nature, and to start treat agricultural lands as agro-ecosystems and work towards land management systems that work with nature instead of against it. The plant-based treaty's 3R principle, relinquish, redirect, and restore, offers a pathway for a plant-based food transition and room for rewilding to reduce greenhouse gases, land use, ocean acidification, freshwater withdrawals, and eutrophication, and bring us back within the safe and just space for global food systems.
Thank you for the inner circle of the plant-based 3D donor economics model. We have chosen 12 social boundaries that focus on the food system and that will address the final battle over whether we successfully deliver on the Paris Agreement and the Paris climate targets rests in whether we transform the global food systems, because we need to cut the greenhouse gas emissions 50% by 2030. And in terms of this intergenerational justice, we need to cut these emissions sooner and faster in rich nations to set a hard target of net zero by 2040. And also to achieve nature and biodiversity recovery by the same year. Governments must urgently end forest and wetland loss by 2030. If we did this, we would have ordered exit rather than stock and a full recovery by 2050. Our report presents the missing action plan that can reduce the 30-year shortfall by incorporating the plant-based 3D model into Kate Raworth's socio-economic model. In this adaptation, we focus on the food systems and widening the lens to incorporate interspecies justice, intergenerational justice, and intragenerational justice. The plant-based 3D has 3 core principles, as having said: relinquish, redirect, and restore. For relinquish, we look into no land use change and indigenous protection. And these 10 proposals are designed to stop the problem increasing and no clearing of forests and other ecosystems for animal farming, and urging to commit to halt and reverse deforestation, accelerating ecosystem restoration, and incentivizing sustainable agriculture. As agricultural expansion is the leading cause of land use change globally and one of the greatest pressures for biodiversity, globally, the agricultural land is 55% of the world's land, where the demand for dairy, milk, and cheese uses the area of the size of Brazil, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Ecuador. Transitioning then to a plant-based diet and to plant-based food systems could not only halt deforestation, but will create an opportunity to resolve 3/4 of agricultural land, moving from current diet to a diet that excludes animal products has then this transformative potential, reducing food land use by 33.1 billion hectares. This is like the data that is behind in the Safe and Just report. Regarding indigenous rights, because food systems transformation also involves indigenous rights. There are, as we know, 5,000 different indigenous peoples expressed across more than 90 countries. And the deep-rooted connections that indigenous peoples have with the land are under severe threat from deforestation and from the expansion of industrial agribusiness. And even though plant-based diets have been at the core of indigenous Mesoamerican civilizations for over 10,600 years, the ancestral knowledge on plants and crops that have been feeding us for generations is being displaced by the intervention of meat industries and big ag. Since the very first introduction of animal farming through colonization until now, with systemic promotion of Western meat-based diets, both the ancestral traditions and the indigenous defenders defending them and nurturing the land are being systematically threatened by these extractivist systems of animal industrial agriculture. Indigenous peoples safeguard 80% of the planet's biodiversity and suffer 36% of killings of land defenders. And at least 1,390 killings of land defenders have been taking place since the adoption of the Paris Agreement. And even though Global Witness, the report says that it can be difficult to identify the exact drivers of the killing of the sun defenders, most of them are connected to the agribusiness intent linkings, which is more than any other sector. And the protections of priority ecosystems, then such as the Amazon rainforest, is a matter of urgency to avoid the worst consequences of the planetary crisis. And then businesses, financiers, governments must protect defenders and bring those who harm them to justice. That is why also development banks must commit to stop financing factory farming that threatens both indigenous and land rights.
From an interspecies justice perspective, we need to have an immediate ban on live animal exports. Brazil and New Zealand have banned live animal exports, and Luxembourg has banned exports to countries outside the EU. In 2023, the UK government announced a ban on the live exports of cattle, sheep, goats, pigs, and horses for fattening or slaughter. Elsewhere, however, water scarcity and increasing demand for meat and dairy products are the key drivers of rising live exports and have reshaped the global marketplace in the process. R number 2, food security. This graph shows the dramatic rise of per global capita meat production in a lifetime between 1980 and the early 2020s. Meat production has grown by about 50% in this short time, with devastating impacts on the world's ecosystems, and causes public health crises, zoonotic diseases, antibiotic resistance, heart disease, type 2 diabetes, and some cancers. These worrying figures show the pressing need to introduce policy measures such as redirecting subsidies to veganic agriculture, introducing meat taxes, a ban on meat advertising, carbon labelling, and funding for far-reaching public education programs. Health. This graph shows the breakdown of consumption of meat in different countries. A recent systematic review of the UK dietary guides found that most are incompatible with our planetary boundaries. The report also found that incorporating environmental sustainability into these guides, such as the plant-based Eat Well guide proposed by the Plant-Based Health Professionals UK, may be the first step towards implementation of population-level policies that have been shown to support shifts away from animal-based foods. The People's Climate Vote, the largest survey of public opinion on the climate crisis, reveals the majority of the public is unaware of the relationship between food and climate change, and unaware of the significant contribution of food emissions. The majority of the public, media, and policymakers are largely unaware that adopting a vegan diet is the single biggest action a person can take to reduce their impact on Earth. It is only when people become aware of the full facts about the impact of our current food system and the far-reaching benefits of plant-based diets that we will see a paradigm shift. We need advertising campaigns beyond the scale we witnessed during COVID-19 pandemic to match the level of the threats to planetary boundaries and their social foundations, SDGs. And over to Enric for finance.
So when it comes to the financial part of all this, we see that between 2015 and 2020, global meat and dairy companies received over $478 billion in backing from firms and banks around the globe. These private financial entities, even though they promote sustainability policies within their investments, such as emissions reporting or zero deforestation commitments, when engaging with animal agriculture companies, the most common ask for investors isn't for concrete emission reductions or stop driving deforestation, but rather for more reporting. What we see here on the slide is some of those financial institutions that have more investments within those industries. And some of these biggest investment firms and banks are deeply implicated in projects that cause vast amounts of deforestation, high emissions, and other environmental degradation. When it comes to multilateral development banks, we see that during the last several years, they committed to shifting their their investment strategies and activities to align with the objectives of the Paris Agreement. However, these entities continue to invest in the global expansion of industrial animal production or factory farming. And we see that leading MDBs such as the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the European Investment Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank invested $4.6 billion in the sector in the last 10 years. The way they do that is by creating Paris Agreement aligned methodologies by which they assess their investments according to which factory farming might be labeled as Paris aligned. Therefore, it is a priority for governments to introduce powerful economic tools, in particular a meat or methane tax. And in addition, stricter regulations are needed on private financial instruments and MDBs to properly address and safeguard the planetary boundaries. Governments also need to redirect subsidies from projects that promote increased consumption of meat and dairy to instead promote plant-based diets and a just transition.
So this graph shows how much of the world's forest has been destroyed by expanding agricultural land. This one. And the benefit of one person switching to a plant-based diet is equivalent to cutting your carbon footprint by 50%, making the single biggest thing an individual can do to bring us back within our ecologically safe and socially just system boundaries. And back to Enric for chapter 3.
So seeing the scale of the problem, there you go, chapter 3 is on cities. So seeing the scale of the problem, we need local, regional, and international action and cooperation to reduce the food impacts with plant-based diets. So the plant-based treaty calls for cities and countries to declare the climate emergency, to calculate consumption-based emissions, and to incorporate plant-based strategies within their climate action plans. It is also important to recognize that major cities will continue to expand and accommodate future populations, and they are already facing extreme weather events such as flooding or heat waves and issues related to air pollution and water shortages. This means that cities must find ways to reduce their land use, water consumption, and greenhouse emissions because they already consume around 70% of the global emissions. So it's imperative that cities address dietary shifts. Despite the notable uptake in plant-based diets in some regions of the world, we see that meat consumption is continuing to rise and is predicted to still increase even more in 2050. The current unsustainable food system urgently needs a global response. And so from Edinburgh in Scotland to Los Angeles in the US, we have 22 cities that have already endorsed the plant-based treaty and that are calling for a negotiation of such treaty as a companion of the Paris Agreement. This year, we saw New York launch a campaign called Eat a Whole Lot More Plants, which educates the public through public awareness campaigns and helps normalize the consumption of healthy plant-based foods. In 2024, Haarlem in the Netherlands will enact a ban on meat adverts in public spaces, which led two additional municipalities, Bloemendaal and Utrecht, to follow suit. And then also North Holland, which is the province where Amsterdam is, was the first province to vote for an advertisement ban on meat, fish, and fossil fuel products. And furthermore, in October 2023, we saw the first country, Denmark, became the first nation in the world to publish a national action plan for plant-based foods to outline how the country can shift towards plant-based diets. And recently we saw South Korea doing the same thing. So even though we're seeing a lot of progress in that direction, due to the magnitude of the situation, the magnitude of the problem, action needs to be faster and more ambitious. That is why we are calling on all governments around the world to negotiate a plant-based treaty to bring food systems within the safe and just space for humanity. And I'll pass it on to my colleague Steve for conclusions.
Yes, thank you very much. So, Food policy is around 30 years behind energy, and with so little time remaining, we need this paradigm shift and action plans at all levels, from individual to institutional to business, city, country, and global. This report makes the case for both individual diet change and policy and system change. Now, before I open the floor up to questions, I would like to conclude with a quote from Johan Rockström, who is a revered climate scientist who brought the planetary boundary framework to the table. And he says that the way that we produce the food in the world is the single largest reason that we have transgressed planetary boundaries. It is the single largest threat to the stability of the planet and our life support systems, from fresh water, pollinators, and soil health, to rainfall generation and the quality of air and water. Food production is putting our future at risk. Thank you. Are there any questions? We don't have time for questions, so you can come and get us after the press conference. Thank you very much.